Hi, everyone. Welcome to another exciting edition of Mr. Parkinson's guided lectures. This one is on the Age of Exploration, which is also housed in Unit 1. It's the second of two guided lectures for this unit. This unit encompasses the Renaissance and exploration. There's a lot of overlap here with world history, but I recognize that it's been 3 years since you guys have taken that course. So I'm going to cover all this material, but I'm going to do it a little bit quicker than normal with the expectation that this is review, primarily review. There's some new stuff in here, of course, but it's primarily review. Because when we tackle exploration in world history, we do it from a Eurocentric perspective, just like a lot of the course, unfortunately. So because of that, much of this is going to sound familiar, at least I hope. So the 6 key themes that I want you to keep in mind here. So we're talking about motivations for exploration, God. I'll do it in order: gold, glory, and God. There is no particular order, but that's the order the words appear there. So wealth of the states, the idea that persons, individuals can achieve glory. This relates to humanism and the Renaissance, which we'll talk about. And of course, religion as a key motivator with God. There's new rivals on the world stage, and we do say world stage now because this is the time when we start talking about the linking of the hemispheres. These rivals are the traditional European rivals that you know: France, Spain, England, but of course we can't forget about the Portuguese and the Dutch. Those are pretty much the big ones at this time period. The slave trade and the spice trade with the Columbian Exchange, that's going to be talked about. The ecology of expansion and how expansion is changing the ecology of the world. The Columbian Exchange also fits into that. The economics of expansion, we'll talk about mercantilism and why mercantilism serves as a force for propelling European exploration forward. Also how European exploration and its effects helps lead to the emergence of capitalism. And last and certainly not least is globalization. Globalization is a word, really a 20th century word, but this is the first time that we can start to see the process of globalization in its infancy. The progenitor of globalization is housed in Unit 1 for sure. So like I said at the outset here, I'm going to go a little quicker than perhaps some of my other guided lectures. So if you need to pause it, please feel free. And also know that if this stuff is review for you and you know it, you don't need to write it down. If you feel like you're going to want to remember it when the AP exam rolls around in May, then by all means, write it down. But if it's something that you already know from world history or even U.S. history, then yeah, feel free to skip right past it. So the first of the European powers who are going to venture out into the ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, are the Iberian Peninsula countries of Spain and Portugal. It's actually Portugal that's going to lead the way. Henry the Navigator, who is one of the sons of the King of Portugal at the time, he becomes very interested in exploration and the possible benefits of exploration for the Portuguese. The Portuguese, if you think about the Iberian Peninsula, are surrounded on all sides by Spain or the Atlantic Ocean or the Mediterranean Sea, but surrounded on all sides by Spain or water. And so Henry views exploration and navigation of the Atlantic Ocean as a possible way for Portugal to break out from their reliance on the benevolence of Spain. So he's going to invest a lot of money into the exploration of the African coast. He's going to convince the Portuguese crown, his father, to invest a lot of money in this as well. And in the early 1400s, by the time we get to the mid 1400s, it's become clear that there is a lot to be gained in exploring the Atlantic Ocean and the African coast. We're talking about the West African coast here. So also cutting out Muslims and their trade. There's urgency added to this after 1453 when the Ottoman Empire conquers Constantinople. And so now all of a sudden, Europeans are viewing themselves as this embattled group against an advancing Islamic world. Muslims are now sweeping into Europe. They're taking over places like Greece. Think about how this relates to the Renaissance, right? Greece, the epicenter of civilization, as Europeans are viewing it, now has been conquered by the Ottoman Empire, by an Islamic empire. And so cutting the Ottomans out of this very lucrative spice trade becomes another one of the causes for exploration. Again, I think you guys know this already, but just, going over it again. So, glory, the idea that people can become famous. The legend of Prester John, which also relates to the third G, God. Prester John is this mythical figure in medieval literature. He's supposedly this Christian king who has founded this incredible, lush, vibrant, rich Christian nation somewhere in it varies. Sometimes it's Asia, sometimes it's Central Asia, but people like Henry the Navigator come to believe that this mythical Christian, this lost Christian realm is actually in Africa. And so the idea of finding Prester John, of reunifying him with the rest of the Christian world in Europe, becomes a force. Seems a little silly to us, but at the time, it's definitely a force. And humanist achievements, the idea that people can become famous just for what they do. They owe a lot to God, but also the celebration of human achievements. Remember, if we think back to the last guided lecture that we did, the humanists believe that God gave humans free will and wants them to achieve greatness. And this links to European exploration pretty clearly. And then the third one is the spread of the Christian religion, developed out of the hope for another crusade. The crusades have died down. Crusades mostly 11th century, 12th century. So now we have an impulse in the European world for new crusades. Led by the Jesuit order in Asia, Africa, and the Americas. The Reformation, which we haven't talked about yet, but the Reformation is going to add urgency to these missionary efforts. In the early 16th century, the Christian world of Europe splits again. It had been split between the Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church. Now it is split between the Catholic Church and these Protestant religions, which we'll talk about in Unit 2. And so now there's a race to spread your brand of Christianity. This is going to be led by the Jesuit missionaries who are from the Catholic faith. But there are going to be other Protestants who are also going to seek to spread their faith. The English Puritans in North America are a great example of this. And so there's urgency here because the Catholic world and Catholics view themselves as embattled now on many sides against an advancing Islam, but also within the church. The church is fracturing, and these Protestant religions are attempting to spread to new areas. Key figures include Francis Xavier here, who is the founder of the Jesuit missionary, I should say the Jesuit order, excuse me, in the Catholic Church. And yeah, the Jesuits are some of the earliest explorers. They go out, their mission is to spread Catholicism to quote unquote uncivilized peoples. So the Jesuits are going to Asia, Africa, and of course the Americas. They are living amongst the native peoples. They are attempting to convert them to Christianity, to Catholic Christianity, and they are also exploring just out of default. You have to find these new people to convert to Catholicism. So new rivals. The Spanish and the Portuguese Empire are going to be the first two European rivals to really emerge from this time period. The Pope in 1493 divides the world amongst the Spanish and the Portuguese, which is kind of silly to think about. But as it becomes clear in the 1490s, there's going to be a race on here. And what the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494 does is it divides the New World between the Spanish and the Portuguese. The Treaty of Tordesillas is done at a time when the Spanish and the Portuguese don't understand what they have found. It is done at a time when the Spanish and the Portuguese believe that Columbus has found a western route to the Indies. And so what we see on this map down here is basically that the Treaty of Tordesillas said, okay, the Portuguese, you can go this way, you can go east, and the Spanish will go west. It becomes clear in the early 1500s that, in fact, this is a new hemisphere, and these are new continents. And that's why the Treaty of Tordesillas looks so unfair to us today, because the Spanish end up getting basically all of the Americas here, and the Portuguese are left with what is essentially modern day Brazil. We'll talk more about that in a moment. Because of the Treaty of Tordesillas, we see the Portuguese and the Spanish empires forming in two very different ways. The Portuguese are going to focus their efforts on the coasts of Africa and South and Southeast Asia. The Spanish are going to focus their efforts on the New World, and that's because of the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494. And so we can see this a little bit more clearly here on the map. The Spanish are going to create a more, how should I say it, land-based empire, I guess you could say. When we look at the Spanish conquest here, they are conquering huge areas of land, present-day Florida, Hispaniola, Latin America, on down into South America. The Portuguese are going to create what becomes known as a trading post empire. They're going to hop along the coast of Africa and Asia, and they're going to set up trading posts along the way. They are going to conquer some fairly large land masses, Indonesia being probably the largest of those, but really their power lies in their trading empire. The Spanish power is going to lie in trade as well, but they are going to also conquer much larger areas of land there. So the Spanish and the Portuguese are the first, but they are by no means the only. We want to think about the big five here, which we see on this map. The Spanish and the Portuguese are first, followed closely by the French, the Dutch, and the British. I have to correct something. I was talking about on this slide, Indonesia is conquered by the Dutch. It is not conquered by the Portuguese. Apologies for that. My brain is not working. So yeah, wanted to point that out before I leave you with that misinformation, the Dutch East Indies over here. So already talked about that. 17th century, early 17th century, the Dutch have also become involved. They're also going to be another trading post empire shortly after the French and the English join the mix. So when we think about the chronology here, it's Portuguese, Spanish. They're basically on the same, they're working at the same time, late 1400s, early 1500s. The Dutch are going to come up in the late 1500s, early 1600s, followed closely by the French and the English. So those are our big five there. Eventually, the Portuguese and the Spanish dominance of the New World is going to fade. It's going to be replaced by the French and the English. And the Dutch are just going to kind of keep on keeping on in Southeast Asia. They're going to do fairly well, but they're going to be focused on trading activities mostly. They're not going to be focused on conquest. They're going to be focused on trade primarily. So the impact of this competition, I think you all know, it's vast and drastic. It leads to the world that we know today, and we'll talk all about that stuff as we go throughout the entirety of the course. So some voyages you should know. Columbus, of course, you know. He reached the Bahamas in October of 1492. He had 3 additional voyages for a total of 4 voyages to the Americas. Important to note, Columbus died believing that he had reached India. He thought that the islands and the peoples he had come into contact with were simply outlying islands to India. The Indies. He believed this is why they're called the West Indies still to this day. The Caribbean is sometimes referred to as the West Indies because that's what Columbus believed he had found. It's not until shortly after his death and exploration continues that it becomes clear to the European powers that in fact this is a new hemisphere with new land masses. So these are his 4 voyages. You can see Columbus is doing most of his activity in the Caribbean Sea, but he is scouting along the Central American coast, actually scouts along the South American coast as well. All of these voyages, however, he just believes he is in the Indies. The significance of Columbus is that not that he finds the Americas. Of course, we know that that's a misnomer. There were millions of people, probably tens of millions of people living in the Americas at the time of Columbus's voyages. Columbus's voyages begin the process of the linking of the hemispheres permanently. Many of you know that Europeans had in fact been to this hemisphere before. The Vikings had been up to Newfoundland a couple hundred years prior to Columbus, but they didn't stay. And that's the key. With Columbus's voyages, a link has been made between the eastern and western hemispheres. that will stay, that will not go away. And so that's the significance of the Columbian voyages. Some additional discoveries: John Cabot sounds like an Englishman, actually an Italian, but he is working for the English. Many of these explorers are just going where the money is. So like Columbus is Italian, but he's working for the Spanish crown. Cabot is also Italian, but he's working for Henry VII. So he's exploring New England. Jacques Cartier, who is, he's French and working for the French. So that's Canada. He's exploring a lot of France and claiming a lot of, Canada for France, why it's referred to as New France. Pedro Cabral, South America, actually by mistake for Portugal. How does this happen by mistake? Because Cabral is seeking to get to India, which he does do, and he's going to do that by making his way along the African coast. But he sails out into the Atlantic and actually touches. He thinks this is an island. He thinks what he touches and lands on is an island off the coast of Africa, and so he plants a flag, figuratively, of course, and claims it for the Portuguese Empire, not knowing that he had just claimed what would become Brazil. So he then continues on his voyage here, which is the red line. The red line is going, and the blue line is coming back. So this is his voyage where he claims, unknowingly, Portugal. It's incredible to me, and I hope it's incredible to you, how many of these explorers had no idea what they were doing. They really did not understand the geography of the Earth, and we shouldn't fault them for that. But it's still funny to me, nonetheless. And three others who I think we should know about. Amerigo Vespucci writes about his voyages. The name America comes from his first name, Amerigo Vespucci. So, not much else to note there about him, at least for the course. Vasco Nunez de Balboa crosses the Isthmus of Panama and into the Pacific Ocean. For Spain, he becomes the first European to sail across the Atlantic and then make it to the Pacific. Of course, Europeans had been in the Pacific Ocean before, but they had gone the long way around Africa and India. And the first European to circumnavigate the Earth, kind of, sort of. He actually dies on the way, but his voyage is the first to successfully circumnavigate the Earth. It lasts for 3 years. Magellan is killed in the Philippines by natives. There he is. So he makes it about halfway around. But there are members of his crew who make it all the way around the Earth. So they are the first Europeans. They're the first people to circumnavigate the globe on their 3-year journey, 1519 to 1522. 19, 20, 21, yeah, a little over 3 years. Sir Francis Drake is going to do the same thing in the late 16th century. He will survive that voyage, but there are members of Magellan's voyage who do make it. So they are the first to circumnavigate the Earth. Another clarification here. It's pretty common knowledge in the early 16th century that the Earth is round. It's a myth that many people believed that Columbus was sailing to his doom off the edge of the Earth. There were, of course, superstitious people who believed that. There are still people who believe that today in the 21st century. But the scientific community, it was pretty common knowledge that the Earth was round by the time we get to the 16th century. So, yeah, for what it's worth. So the Spanish Empire, let's take a look at the Spanish Empire first. So the encomienda, again, this is hearkening back to world history. The crown is granting these conquistadors rights to use native labor and collect tribute from them. In return, the conquistadors were supposed to take care of the natives. Air quotes definitely around that. It did not happen. And in fact, there were abuses galore in the encomienda system, to say nothing of the fact that the natives were dying in huge numbers from diseases which the Europeans had unknowingly brought with them. We'll talk more about that in a second. The conquistadors had no qualms about mistreating the natives themselves, quite literally working the natives to death. This is exposed by Bartolomé de las Casas, who is portrayed in this painting here. He writes a lot in the late 16th century about these abuses that he is witnessing. at the hands of the conquistadors. So this leads to a shift in governing policies in the Spanish Empire, not because the crown necessarily was so appalled by these abuses, but more that they viewed the encomienda system as not sustainable, as something that could not sustain. If these conquistadors keep abusing the natives to the extent that they were, the natives might revolt, the natives will die, and the encomienda system will collapse. And so the Spanish crown recognizes, hey, this is not a sustainable thing that's going on here. And so the encomienda system is replaced by the viceroy system, which are crown appointed, basically regional governors who are appointed by the king, sent to the New World, and the viceroys are the ones who are supposed to administer the Americas. It takes away this very laissez-faire, very free market, conquistador-led encomienda system and replaces it with something that is much more bureaucratic in nature. The viceroys are assisted by advisory councils called audiencias. Again, this is harkening back to world history. So we have the beginnings of a decentralized bureaucracy in the Americas, but still one that is controlled by the Spanish crown. We can't forget about the church. The Spanish crown's authority does supersede the church in the Americas. However, the church is okay with this because the Spanish crown has committed itself to converting natives where possible, and they are doing this through the Catholic missionaries. Primarily, okay? The Spanish Inquisition, which is late 15th, early 16th century, is also going to give fuel to this. The Spanish Inquisition, we're going to talk a little bit more about that in Unit 2 when we talk about the Reformation, but it does link to the New World as well. So a lot to review here, so I'm going to fly through this. So the slave trade. Slavery is not new. Slavery has been around for thousands of years. Slavery in Africa was not new. What is new is the extent to which slaves are being captured in Africa and brought to Europe, the Middle East, to to a lesser extent, although it is happening in very large numbers. What is happening here is that the slave trade is becoming an industry. We can start to talk about the industrialization of the slave trade. If we go back prior to the 15th century, when we're looking at the slave trade, we tend to look at things like the trading of war captives. We tend to look at domestic servants. The slavery is still happening, and it's happening in fairly large numbers, but it is not an industry to the extent that it is going to be made into one especially after the 16th century. When we start getting into the 17th century, we start to see this industry emerging where plantation farming is escalating due to the demand for sugarcane, tobacco as well. And so this is going to then escalate the demand for slaves. Native Americans are tried as slaves, but it does not work. It does not work because they are more susceptible to European diseases, and it doesn't work because they know the geography better than African slaves, and so they are more likely to run away. They know the language of other local tribes, so it is easier for them to organize. African slaves are not able to do any of this. So this, of course, leads to the triangular trade, which you all know. Up to 10 million African slaves are ripped away from Africa and brought forcibly to the Americas between the 16th and the 19th centuries. There is a high death rate on the way, on the way, the Middle Passage, talking about something like 20% of slaves are not going to survive that voyage. Many of these slaves are prisoners of war, but many of these slaves are later, as this industry grows, are captured by West African civilizations who are going into the interior of West Africa and are capturing large numbers of rival African tribespeople, and they are bringing them back to the coasts of West Africa, which is leading to the depopulation of interior African kingdoms. The political effects of the slave trade in Africa are massive. We see West African civilizations on the Gold Coast in Senegal, the Benin Kingdom, getting very wealthy off of this trade. The power of local African leaders does increase on the western coast of Africa. So we shouldn't forget about that. That's lesser concern for AP European history. Criticism of slavery does happen. The Quakers are some of the early critics of slavery with the Enlightenment. We should not overstate the extent to which slavery is being criticized, and this is really not happening until the 18th century. It is happening. It's happening. The criticism of slavery is happening in small numbers. 17th, 18th century, it's starting to grow, but really slavery is not going to be criticized vocally in any meaningful way until the late 18th century. That's where we want to place it. Movement of slaves and the direction where they are headed. You can see the vast majority of slaves are heading into South America and the Caribbean. This is where the very large plantations are located. It's also where the climate is really inhospitable, and so slaves are being worked to death in these areas. We have smaller numbers for the slave trade up into our area of the world, but slavery in North America is going to be a self-perpetuating institution. We have men and women who are being brought into the relatively temperate North American areas, and by the time we get to the late 1700s, the slave trade really isn't necessary for the institution of slavery to perpetuate itself in North America. This cannot be said for the Caribbean and for South America because the environment is so inhospitable. These plantation slaves are being worked to death, which we see in North America, but we do not see to the same extent. So that's why you see those numbers. Okay. So the spice trade in Southeast Asia, extremely lucrative. Portugal is going to be a flash in the pan. The Portuguese do not have the means to sustain their empire. So by the time we get to like 1600, the Portuguese empire is really fading fast. Spain is definitely operating in Southeast Asia. So they seize the Philippines as a trade base. Manila is going to be one of the most important ports in the global trade, specifically of silver. This is more of an AP world thing. We don't need to be as concerned about it in AP Euro, but the silver trade and the Spanish are the ones who are mining the silver in I'm thinking Mexico. I'm like South America. No, Southern North America and Central America. They're mining this silver and they're taking it over to Asia, where they are using that silver to exchange for Asian silk and spices, which are then being taken to Europe. The Dutch are really going to become involved in Southeast Asia. They're going to seize these spice islands from Portugal, the Dutch East Indies. They're going to build a fort in Jakarta for protection. The Dutch East India Company is going to become a very, very lucrative enterprise. We often talk about the British East India Company. The Dutch East India Company is more powerful and more lucrative than the British East India Company in the early 1600s due to their activity in the Spice Islands of Southeast Asia. And so the Dutch are going to control most of Southeast Asia by the end of the 18th century. In our country, we don't often talk about the Dutch Empire because it is a trading empire and because their activities are almost exclusively confined to Southeast Asia. They're really not too active in North America, in the Americas at all. The exception to that is New Amsterdam, which becomes New York, but the Dutch are driven out of there pretty quickly in the mid-1600s. So I think this is one of the reasons why it's a blind spot in American classrooms. But the power of the Dutch, especially as merchants, is really extraordinary. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a moment when we talk about stock markets. England, very limited presence in Southeast Asia. England's presence in Asia is going to increase drastically, but not until we get to the 1800s, the 19th century. Mainland Southeast Asia generally, we are not talking about European presence there when before the 1800s. So Europeans are pretty confined to the coasts. And that's true of everywhere we see European activity. The Americas, Africa, South Asia, India, and Southeast Asia. Until we get to 1800 and beyond, Europeans are basically confined to the coasts. They do not have the power or they don't have the means to push into the interior. So Burma, Thailand, Vietnam, Burma is the colonial name, Myanmar is the present name, ultimately are unified against Europeans and resisting. So we see loose trade relations in these areas, but Europeans really for about 300 years don't have a lot of power in Southeast Asia. A lot of trading posts, but not a lot of like political or military power. Okay. So the Columbian Exchange, of course, is huge when we're talking about this. This is another world history thing, so I'll fly through this. Horses and cattle are going to the Americas. Think of how they transformed the Americas. Sugarcane and wheat, plantation-style cultivation, tobacco here as well, coffee here as well to lesser extents, completely changing the ecology of these areas. Sweet potatoes and maize to Africa from the Americas. Think about the impact of these things. I mean, it's massive. It completely changes the world as we know it. I see this chart every year when I teach about the Columbian Exchange, or this map, I should say. It still just blows my mind when you think about the extent to which the Columbian Exchange in 100 years really completely revolutionizes the economies, the ecology, the geography, the diets of the world. Of course, most of the things that we want to talk about are flowing from Europe to the Americas. These are things that are completely changing the ecology of the Americas. Sugarcane, we just talked about. Livestock, of course. Diseases, for sure. By the time we get to about 1650, the Americas have basically been depopulated. Estimates range in the number of Native Americans who are killed by disease, but it's somewhere between like 80 and 95% of Native Americans. Those numbers are really unfathomable. Smallpox is doing most of the destruction here, but all of these diseases, when Native Americans encounter them, are just awful. They are deadly to entire civilizations. Of course, things are flowing from the Americas to Europe that are pretty significant. When we talk about diets, beans, potatoes, sweet potatoes, these are things that become central to people's diets. The most famous example is Ireland and the significance of potatoes to Ireland, so significant that when the potato crop collapses in the mid-19th century, the island of Ireland basically loses half of its population. It depopulates. So there is a significant flow of things, goods, people, animals, diseases, both ways in the Columbian Exchange. I won't belabor the point anymore. So world history stuff, again, the Inca Empire as well as the Aztec Empire are both conquered by the Spanish. I focus here on the Inca, just a choice, but the Aztec conquered by Cortez, the Inca conquered by Pizarro. Smallpox had actually showed up to the Inca Empire prior to Pizarro, and it had claimed a lot of lives. It had triggered a civil war, and Pizarro just exploited that. He captures Atahualpa, pictured here, and made famous by that sort of corny National Geographic Guns, Germs, and Steel video that you all have probably seen in middle or sometimes some teachers still show it in world history. So Atahualpa is captured, and eventually he is killed by Pizarro, and the Inca Empire is overthrown by the Spanish. In 1535, What allows Europeans to do this? Jared Diamond has one answer, which is guns, germs, and steel. We won't get into it too much further than that because it is a world history thing, and I think you all know it fairly well. So economics here, there's a lot of economic changes that are brought about by the Columbian Exchange. There is a price revolution that goes on. We start to see the inflation of most goods, including food. And this is still something that happens today. Don't ask me to explain why. I am not an economist. But when we look at prices of goods and services, they tend to inflate about 1.5% to 2% every year. Now, the problem that is happening in 16th century Europe is wages are not reflecting this increase. There's some reasoning for this, and we don't need to get too far into it, but the influx of gold and silver plus a population boom are our causes here. This is creating a strain on the European economy in the 16th century. By the time we get to the 17th century, the European economy is going to start to stabilize a little bit with the growth of mercantilism and later commercial capitalism. When we talk about the growth of commercial capitalism, we should really place that in the 18th century. And when we talk about mercantilism, we're talking 17th century. So joint stock trading companies, this is like proto-capitalism. This is like pre-capitalism. So joint stock trading companies, the British East India Company and the Dutch East India Company, the Dutch VOC, these are the joint stock trading companies that we want to think about. Okay, they are making huge profits in shipbuilding, metallurgy, and mining. This leads to new economic institutions. Think about banks, banking industry. Small family banks are being replaced by banking institutions. The Fuggers in Germany, this is a very wealthy and famous banking family that is going to develop into basically a banking institution. They're a good example of this. The Bank of Amsterdam is another good example of this. Perhaps the best example I can give you is the Amsterdam Beurs. I'm sure I'm saying that wrong, but it is founded in 1602. It is the world's first formal stock exchange, a place where traders come together and exchange stocks. Stock market, we know the stock market today. Again, talk about something I cannot explain, but the first one occurs in Amsterdam, is founded in Amsterdam, and it's still around today. It has changed names. I think it's called like Euronext today, but the Amsterdam Beurs, the Euronext can trace its lineage back over 400 years. When we look at these changes, we need to take a step back and consider what they are changing. They're changing European economies, but they are these changes are slow. They are revolutionary in some ways, but they are also evolutionary in some ways. We have not had the Industrial Revolution yet. Industrial Revolution is mid-18th century. So when we look at these economies, they are still primarily agricultural. The lives of peasants, if we were to go to any of these European countries in 1700, the average peasant is still living in basically the same manner as the average peasant was 300, 400, 500 years prior to that. Their lives in some ways are worse, and so we don't want to overstate these changes. State economies are beginning to change, and they are changing in ways that are going to lead to drastic changes down the road. But between 1500 and 1750, for most people, these changes are not really seen. Okay. So what is mercantilism? Mercantilism is the idea that economies should be heavily state-controlled. They should be heavily controlled by the governments of the state, the government of the state, and that imports should not exceed exports. We want to export. We want to sell more than we buy. So European powers are competing for wealth. They want to get as much wealth as possible. War through peaceful means is a way we can think about this. There is a huge rush in the 1500s and especially the 1600s to accumulate as much wealth as possible. And so the importance of bullion, this is like, gold, silver, and a favorable balance of trade is what is key to European powers in the 1500s and 1600s, really until capitalism begins to take over in the 1700s. So high tariffs on foreign goods, on imports. This is the way that states are attempting to regulate trade, and the use of colonies as a source of raw materials. This is why colonies are so important to many of these European powers, because it allows them to accumulate wealth. They're going to take these raw materials from the colonies for free, essentially, and then they're going to turn those raw materials into manufactured goods, which they will sell at a premium, thus ensuring the economic health of the state. So that is mercantilism. Of course, there are going to be European rivalries who emerge out of this competition. Anytime we see competition this vast, we're going to see rivalries. Piracy is quite common. Piracy is also state-sponsored. Countries are funding pirates. They are doing it clandestinely. They are doing it quietly. But piracy is common and state-sponsored by all of the major European powers. European rivalries also determined alliances and international wars. We'll take a look at that stuff a little bit later. So some new views of the world, the Mercator map and the Mercator projection. This is the first Mercator map from the mid to late 1560s. It's when the first Mercator projection map is created. And this is still the most common way that we view the map today. There's a lot of problems with the Mercator projection. It makes the things north and south seem way bigger than they are. But the benefits of the Mercator projection for the time is that it standardizes a view of the world. North is up, south is down. Europe, of course, is in the center of the map. There's like social and political implications to this today, which we should not ignore. So the Mercator map, we still haven't really found anything better in a little over 400 years. All of the problems with the Mercator map and how it misrepresents the size and shape of the Earth, it's still the best way for us to put a poster up on our wall and understand the land masses of the Earth. Also helps trigger more exploration because it becomes clearer to people. I guess we can say this is clearer, clearer what the Earth looks like, and of course the psychological impact. The relative ease of conquering, it reinforces the belief in the superiority of European civilization and values. Put Europe right dead center in the middle of the world there. So, take it all in. This is the world as it exists in the 17th century from a European perspective. This is like 18th century, my apologies, 1700s, late 18th century. And again, I think you all have seen this. Mostly. The Portuguese Empire has faded drastically. They're really just left with a few trading posts out in Southeast Asia as well as Brazil. This is the time when the British and French empires are really on the rise. The Dutch have a massive trading empire, but it's localized to Southeast Asia. The Russian Empire, we don't often think of this as an empire. Again, this is our bias in North America, but it very much is. A vast empire. And the Spanish are still hanging around, but their power is also diminishing in the Americas. Okay. So this is basically our last slide here. So the overseas trade and colonies, a movement towards globalization. So transoceanic trade is very valuable in luxury goods, but we should not overstate the extent to which transoceanic trade is happening, also the extent to which transoceanic trade is changing Europe. The Darwin reading that you are going to do in class, oh yes, the Darwin reading, is, I think, great at pointing out the fact that by 1750, so we're talking like 300 years after Prince Henry the Navigator, by 1750, these trading empires are pretty small. They're not really powerful. Their survival, many of them, is still in question. And Europeans, when we compare their relative power to the Islamic world and the Asian world, Europeans are matched by the Islamic world and the Asian world, or in some instances, outmatched by these great empires. You know, the Ottoman, the Mughal, the Safavid, the Qing in in China. So we shouldn't overstate the extent to which this European trade is changing the world. However, by the time we get to the late 1700s, that's when we really start to see this takeover. There's a shift in the balance of trade, becomes overseas trade versus intra-European trade, and we couple it with the Industrial Revolution starting in England and spreading rapidly, and that's where we really start to see the time where these European empires are pushing inward, and these trading patterns are beginning to change the entire world. Okay, so I'll just leave you with some discussion questions to think about. These are, think of these as like, if you got these on the AP Euro exam, would you be able to answer them? That's the way that I encourage you to think about these analytical discussion questions, and we'll hopefully have a chance to talk about them in class. Okay, so that's our guided lecture. 45 minutes. Whew! Did it. Congrats, guys.